Poliomyelitis, also known as polio, was a viral disease in the 1940s and early 1950s. There were 3,145 deaths caused by polio in the U.S. in 1952, making this virus most commonly found in the U.S. at the time. This disease received the nickname childhood paralysis due to its tendency to immobilize its victims. This disease spreads to your brain and spinal cord in order to paralyze the body. Polio also affects your ability to breathe. Poliovirus attacks the motor neurons of the brain stems, reducing breath capacity and causing difficulty in swallowing and speaking.
Jonas Salk, born on October 28, 1914, invented the polio vaccine in 1955. When released, the polio vaccine helped polio rates drop dramatically. In 1960, there were 2,525 cases of paralytic polio, and just 5 years later, in 1965, that number dropped all the way down to 61.
In 1905, Swedish physician Ivar Wickman discovered the poliovirus to be contagious. 5 years later, research from Simon Flexner first brought up the idea of a vaccine to this deadly virus, leading 2 separate teams to attempt this medical marvel in 1935. Discouragingly, both teams failed, causing their test subjects to actually contract polio and die. It wasn't until 1955 when Jonas Salk's vaccine test finally proved 80 to 90% effective and received a government license to begin injecting it into the millions of Americans in danger. On May 8, 1955, however, the vaccine program was suspended due to paralysis showing in people who received the injection. Changes were made, and the program was back up on May 27th of the same year. In 1962, Albert Sabin licensed an oral version of the vaccine.
When Jonas Salk was 2 years old in 1916, the United States suffered their worst polio epidemic yet, with a final tally of 27,000 cases, 6,000 of them being fatal. At the time, Salk was living with his parents in New York City, the hardest hit city that year. Salk was too young to remember the terror our country suffered that year, but the stories he heard later on about it inspired him to fight back against the disease. "20 years later, he entered NYU Medical School and planned not to be a physician, but a researcher. His logic behind this decision was that when a patient came into the doctor's office wheezing and in pain, a disease had already scored a hit. Better to develop ways to prevent people from getting sick in the first place. Together with Thomas Francis, Salk created the first influenza preventive for the use of the U.S. military during World War I. After that, Salk traveled to the University of Pittsburgh to establish his own research lab. The NFIP, also known as the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, founded by Franklin D. Roosevelt, was always on the hunt for scientific talent, and when they heard Jonas Salk was available, they pounced. They provided Salk with lots of work and funds, and in a couple of years, Salk began developing the elusive vaccine. He and his research team spent countless hours figuring out each step of the process, and finally, in April of 1954, the NFIP gave them approval for a nationwide field trial of 1.8 million people. The polio vaccine had been made. Due to Dr. Salk's efforts, as well as the efforts of others, the polio virus has almost been completely eradicated from the face of Earth. Although some cases still exist today, the polio virus is no longer the feared epidemic it once was. Within 7 years after the introduction of the vaccine in 1955, the number of cases of polio in this country have fallen from a high of nearly 58,000 cases in 1952 to around 1,300 cases in 1961, a 97% decrease from the average of 40,000 cases in the 4 years prior to the use of the vaccine.
Poliovirus attacks certain kinds of nerve cells, and for hundreds of years it killed and crippled, especially children. By 1952, Dr. Jonas Salk and his research team at the University of Pittsburgh had developed a killed virus vaccine against polio. The effort to eradicate the disease started small, with Dr. Salk and his team immunizing a few thousand students in the Pittsburgh area. But soon it became a nationwide mobilization to protect every child against the polio threat. Salk's vaccine and the live polio vaccine developed later by Albert Sabin were effective in controlling the viral disease.